Please be seated.
Thank you, Your Honour. The purpose of today's panel, Your Honour, is to largely understand the work that has been done in the 5 metropolitan archdioceses and the reforms that have been undertaken to ensure the protection of children. And we have each of the archbishops present to give evidence today.
Gentlemen, it's necessary for you all to be sworn. I assume you'll all take an oath on the Bible. Yes. That's right. And there should be a... You too? Oath on the Bible?
No, I have already been sworn in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course, I forgot you last time too. I'm sorry, Archbishop. You're excused from this event. But the other 4 of you, would you find a Bible? There should be one there. And stand for me. And with your hand on the Bible, repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission
that the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
the
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat again. Archbishop, I trust you feel comfortable there. We didn't have a capacity to accommodate you with the other 4.
I feel demoted, Your Honour, but very satisfied.
Very well, thank you.
I'll start with you, Archbishop Coleridge.
Yeah.
Would you tell the Royal Commission again your full name?
Mark Benedict Coleridge.
And you are the Archbishop of Brisbane?
The Archbishop of Brisbane, correct.
Thank you. If I can turn to you, Archbishop Hart, would you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Dennis James Hart.
And Archbishop, you've given evidence before the Royal Commission earlier.
I have.
And you are the Archbishop of Melbourne?
Correct.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
I'm Anthony Colin Joseph Fisher, and I'm the Archbishop of Sydney.
Thank you. And you haven't given evidence earlier, have you?
I have not.
Thank you. Archbishop Wilson?
Philip Edward Wilson, the Archbishop of Adelaide.
And you have given evidence earlier?
Twice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Timothy John Costello, the Archbishop of Perth.
Thank you. Now, each of you has provided a statement to the Royal Commission answering a series of questions that were put to you. That's right?
Yes.
Yes.
And you have referred to a range of policies, procedures and reforms that have been undertaken in relation to each of your archdioceses.
Yes.
Correct.
Now, each of those documents have been tendered or has been tendered and is in evidence, just so that you're aware that it's already before the Royal Commission. Can I start with you, Archbishop Costello? You have a copy of your statement before you.
I do, yes.
Now, if I can start with you, Archbishop Costello. You have a copy of your statement before you.
I do, yes.
Statement. Yes. As a preamble, as it were, to your statement, you gave reasons as to why you considered that the reforms that you've set out in your statement were necessary.
Yes.
And the first reason you give is the high incidence of sexual abuse of minors by clergy, religious and other church personnel in the Catholic Church indicates that there has been a catastrophic failure in relation to the protection of children in the Church in Australia.
Yes.
Now, is that a catastrophic failure of leadership?
It certainly is a catastrophic failure of leadership. Yes, I think it's a catastrophic failure in many respects, but primarily in leadership, yes.
What other respects?
Well, in a sense, I suppose many of the things that I would mention in many ways relate to poor leadership. One of the things that occurs to me is that the very reality of the sexual abuse of children and young people is such a fundamental betrayal of what the Catholic Church purports to stand for that I have spent a lot of time reflecting on how it is that someone who has given his or her life to the Church could be engaged in these kinds of activities. And that leads me to reflect that there's also been a catastrophic failure in keeping keeping the best way I can express it is in keeping people faithful to the commitments they made. So I asked myself, what can possibly have gone wrong, or what was missing, or what has been out of balance that could lead not just to one, which would be bad enough, but to countless people failing in this way.
Thank you. Archbishop Wilson, can I ask you whether you share Archbishop Costello's view in relation to the catastrophic failure, primarily in terms of leadership, but in other matters?
Yes, I do share that.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
I do also.
Archbishop Hart?
Certainly.
Archbishop Coleridge?
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Archbishop Costello, in your second point, you refer to the response to the scandal by some church authorities, especially in the past, as hopelessly inadequate. Is that the strongest term you think applies to the response of some church authorities to the scandal?
I think it's a fair description. It's perhaps could be augmented by other descriptions. I think it's been scandalously insufficient, hopelessly inadequate, scandalously inefficient. I'm struggling for other words. It's just such a fundamental failure that I'm not sure what else I could say.
The consequences of that hopelessly inadequate response have been catastrophic, haven't they?
Yes.
Now, Archbishop Wilson, do you agree with Archbishop Costello's view as to the response of the church?
I do. I think that people were all at sea and really unaware of what they needed to do.
Well, that's perhaps a reason for it rather than the nature of it. Is there anything more you'd say about the nature of the response?
I agree with what Archbishop Costello said about that, and I think that his description of it is really accurate.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
Yes, I entirely agree. I think you might want to use stronger words in some cases, that there was a kind of criminal negligence to deal with some of the problems that were staring us in the face. In other cases, I think there were people that were just like rabbits in the headlights. They just had no idea what to do, and their performance was appalling.
Thank you. Archbishop Hart?
I'd make my own very much the words that Archbishop Fisher used and the description that he gave. Totally inadequate, just totally wrong.
Thank you. Archbishop Coleridge?
It strikes me that the failure, which was colossal, was in some ways a colossal failure of culture. Because, you see, you had leaders who were in themselves decent, good and experienced men, but who in very different places and different times made exactly the same mistakes without comparing notes or even talking to each other about it informally. Now, where you find those kinds of convergences, I think that's when you're dealing with culture. So if it was, as I think it is, a colossal failure of leadership, it did amount, and I think this has emerged through the process of the Royal Commission, in important ways as a colossal fail of culture that led to the colossal failure of leadership.
Thank you. Coming back to you, Archbishop Costello, in your last sub-point under paragraph 6, you say that because the Catholic Church as an institution has been responsible for many shocking incidents, the Church has an obligation to now be a significant part of the solution.
Yes.
Now, this statement of yours was signed in September of last year.
Yes.
Since that date, you have no doubt become aware of the data
Yes.
by the church authorities in relation to claims
Yes.
of sexual abuse. Is there anything you would revise in relation to that paragraph, having regard to the data you're now aware of?
I'm not exactly sure what
You referred to there being many shocking incidents of child sexual abuse.
Yes.
Is there anything you'd want to add to that in light of the data from the Catholic Church authorities that you're now aware of?
Well, I suppose as I read it, the word many might just be completely inadequate. when the data was released, I looked both broadly at the data for the whole of Australia and in particular, of course, also at the data for my own archdiocese. It's a sad thing to have to admit, but I wasn't surprised. I've been the Archbishop for 5 years. I've dealt with many allegations and sat with many survivors of sexual abuse. Sometimes I get very discouraged because it seems that quite regularly, in a sense, another complaint will come forward, and you start to wonder, just how extensive this is. So I wasn't surprised by it. I'd have to confess that I was surprised that our percentage, not that it was as high as it was, but that it was amongst one of the highest in the country, because I had thought that other dioceses might have an even worse record than our own. Every time we face these statistics or come across another allegation or find another person whose life has been so damaged by sexual abuse, it's a shocking thing. And so I think you can be unsurprised but nevertheless constantly shocked and horrified. I think what I was trying to say in the last point there is that precisely because we have failed so badly, our society has a right to expect us to do what we can to contribute to a solution if we can. I mean, there may be many people who would think that our record and our reputation is so damaged that we have nothing to offer, and I would understand that, but I think that tragically and unfortunately we've learnt an awful lot about this terrible scourge. We have over the years, not just in my diocese but around the country, made a number of attempts to respond to it, some more successful than others. So there are some learnings there that I think we might be able to offer for consideration by the wider society. That was the point I was trying to make.
And you're saying in that point, aren't you, that it is an institutional responsibility for what has happened?
Yes, I am, yes.
Archbishop Wilson, you'd agree that the Catholic Church as an institution is responsible for the events?
I would agree with that. On the other hand, I would say that when you look at the nature of the Catholic Church, it's more complex than just saying that it's an institution. There are some institutional aspects of it which were failures here, but there are many people who belong to our church who are not responsible for this.
So are you talking about parishioners and congregations and the like?
I am.
You're not talking about the leadership of the church or office holders of the church?
No, I'm just saying that there's a distinction when you talk about responsibility between those two groups.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think I'd want to say it's both. There are individuals that should be held to account for terrible deeds or terrible failures to respond once they knew of things happening. And then there's a sense in which the institution as a whole, or the Catholic community as a whole, hangs its head in shame, and its leaders in particular have to do what they can to bring about redress and healing, to make sure we're a safer church in the future. So I think it's both a corporate and an individual responsibility, and we have to hold everyone to account.
Thank you. Archbishop Hart?
I certainly would be totally committed to what has been said already and would endorse that as if they were my own words. But I also say that because it's been so awful, so cataclysmic, that we have a much more serious responsibility to be part of remaking and of the future.
Thank you. Archbishop Coleridge, I know you've spoken on these matters before. Is there anything you wish to add?
Well, just to say that I do think we're dealing with a very powerful and complex interplay between individual and institutional responsibility. But I would never underestimate the institutional responsibility. But it doesn't cancel the individual responsibility. The other thing is Archbishop Costello speaks about the possibility of being part of a solution. It seems to me it's not just a possibility, it is an obligation that we have to be part of the solution, but not on our own, to be working with others, whoever the others may be, to be part of the solution. I see that as a most solemn obligation imposed upon us, first of all, by the demands of the gospel, but secondly, by the demands of responsible citizenship. And I say this as a leader of an institution that is hugely embedded in this society and therefore has a special responsibility to exercise responsible citizenship, which in this particular regard we have failed to do.
Now, I'll come back to the question of why, which you've touched upon, Archbishop Costello.
Yes.
And as I've indicated, there's various reforms that each of you have instituted, and there are policies, practices and guidelines which have been provided to the Royal Commission, and I'll come back to those in some detail as well. But firstly, looking at what you have done individually in response to the tsunami as it has been described, each of you has at some stage apologised, I think. Perhaps if I can start with you, Archbishop Costello. Have you issued an apology?
I have, yes, on a number of occasions, yes.
And were those apologies in writing?
They were, yes. What I have done, generally speaking, is in what we would call pastoral letters to the people, the Catholic community of the Archdiocese of Perth. I've tried to address these matters on probably 4 or 5 occasions in the 4 or 5 years in the 5 years that I've been there, and I have included in those what I know to be a very sincere apology. I hope that it's been understood that way to the victims and survivors. Yes.
Thank you. Archbishop Wilson?
In both of the dioceses that I've been involved with, I have issued apologies. In
the same format as Archbishop Costello?
Pretty much in writing, but also verbally in some circumstances too.
To public meetings and the like?
In a couple of cases at work, public meetings, yes.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
Yes. I have in both the dioceses, I've had responsibility for in writing as videos that people access on the internet that are played in all the churches, from the pulpit, at public meetings, in lots of different formats. I authored for all the bishops of my province, all the bishops of New South Wales, a joint letter of apology a few years ago, and I have kept saying again and again, as loudly as I can, no excuses, no cover-ups, no pedophiles ever again near our churches and schools. And I repeat again in this forum today my apology for the shameful things that have happened, especially the harm to the victims.
Archbishop Hahn?
Certainly in writing and in public statements I've expressed how gravely I feel that the situation that the people have been wronged and the terrible, terrible suffering that people have undergone, and on behalf of the Church and in meeting with individual victims and others too, I've tried to express myself. I know in inadequate ways just how sorry I am that these things ever happen, which are the very opposite of what the Church should be about and of the contribution we should be making to society.
Archbishop Coleridge?
Yes, like the other archbishops, I have on a number of occasions and in various parts of Australia, I have offered written apologies and things like pastoral letters. I have offered apology in videoed messages, but also verbally, both publicly and privately. It's certainly been a crucial part of my dealings with survivors of abuse. So in various ways, I have sought to offer an apology that has grown in strength and sincerity, I have to say, through the years.
Now, each of you, I take it, will accept that the delivery of apologies and the creation and publication of practices, policies and guidelines is necessary but not sufficient in terms of dealing with child sexual abuse by clergy. Do you all accept that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
What has appeared in the evidence before the Royal Commission generally, and also the evidence of the Baroness this morning, that what is most needed is for the victim survivors to be listened to by the leadership of the Church. Now, each of you accepts that that evidence is real?
Yes.
Now, again, can I start with you, Archbishop Costello? Can you tell us what you personally have done in terms of listening to individual victims and survivors?
Really, my listening is almost exclusively focused on my private meetings with survivors of sexual abuse at the end of the process of engagement with the Towards Healing protocols. And so I always meet the survivor of sexual abuse in a facilitation meeting, is the way the professional standards Towards Healing protocols describe it. That can sometimes be a very lengthy encounter, and we certainly give it whatever time it needs. It always also includes an expression, and again, I know it to be a genuine expression of apology, of sorrow, of regret, of shame for what has happened. And yes, part of that process, the structure of that process, is to give the survivor as much time and opportunity as he or she needs to tell the story. And for me, as the Archbishop, to assure them not only that I've listened to them, but that I believe them. And I think that that's a very important part of the process.
And that's in the context of a person coming to your archdiocese,
yes,
making a claim or seeking some form of redress under Towards Healing.
Making a complaint, yes.
And the meeting is conducted with you, the survivor, and whoever else she or he wants present?
It's normal, well, always. It's monitored, I guess, is the word I would use, by someone who facilitates. It's why it's called a facilitation. So an independent person who acts as a kind of a facilitator of the encounter. There is the survivor, him or herself, with a support person or anybody else that they may want to bring with them, with me as the church leader, and normally with someone that I would have to support me as well.
And that is at the initiative of the survivor?
It's part of the process if the survivor chooses to have it, yes.
Thank you. Now, in your statement, you refer to the Towards Healing process.
Yes.
And if we can turn to paragraph 28 of that statement. Now, you refer there to where the findings of the assessment do not satisfy the Archbishop, that is you, of the truth of the complaint. The Director of Professional Standards may recommend that you respond to the victim in a pastoral meeting. Now, that's not the meeting you've described, is it?
No, that's a different meeting. So the facilitation meeting is at the end of the Towards Healing process. Perhaps if I could just explain briefly, when an allegation is brought forth or a complaint, sometimes the person who's being accused is deceased, and that's in fact most of the time, in my experience, in the situations that I've dealt with in Perth. But occasionally the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, may still be alive. If he or she, and normally it's he, of course, disputes that or denies it, then the process of Towards Healing would be that some independent assessors are appointed to look into the story, basically. Now, they're independent of me. I don't appoint them. The Director of Professional Standards appoints them. They conduct some inquiries to the best that they're able to. And according to the protocols of Towards Healing, as I understand them, they reach a finding on what I think is understood to be on the balance of probabilities, which I think is the level of evidence, if that's the right word, for civil cases. I think that's right. I think that's the procedure.
Is it the case that it is invariably you who meets with the survivor when indeed they wish a meeting with the church to take place?
I would normally meet with the survivor right at the end of the process. But
is that you from the church that meets with the survivor, or may it be you or a senior member of the church?
Normally, unless I'm unavailable for some reason, some serious reason. If I'm, for example, I think we had a case where the process was coming to an end. I was away and would be away for some weeks, and so we gave the survivor the option of waiting until I returned or meeting the auxiliary bishop or the vicar general. So it's always one of the leaders of the church, one of the leaders of the church authority, but with very few exceptions, it's me.
Outside the formal facilitation process that you've described, have you met with survivors individually?
Sometimes the first approach is directly to me, and depending on the nature of that approach, I might meet with the person who's making the allegation or the complaint initially, and I'm willing to do that, but I'm sensitive to the fact that often it's very difficult for people to have to tell this story over and over again, and if they tell it to me, which I'm happy to hear, the next step is then to go to the Professional Standards Office and tell it again, and then they may have to tell it again to prepare a contact report. And so my practice really is, as quickly as I can, to refer someone immediately to the Professional Standards Office.
Have you met with victims outside of the Towards Healing process?
On rare occasions, yes. Sometimes a person will prefer not to go through the Towards Healing process, doesn't really want to go through a legal process, just wants to meet with the church authority. And on 2 or 3 occasions I have done that, yes.
Have you indicated to those within your archdiocese a willingness to meet with survivors who wish to talk to you outside of any redress process?
I can't say that I've made public statements about that. No, the people who deal with these matters in the Archdiocese know that I'm very prepared to meet with people, but it's not kind of a public announcement. Perhaps it should be.
Archbishop Wilson?
The majority of meetings that I've had with survivors has been as a result of the Towards Healing process in the facilitated meetings. There have been other occasions where I've met people who are survivors as well on a private basis. They've just asked to talk to me, and I've tried to make it clear to people that I'm willing and open to talk in any set of circumstances. I have to say, though, to be honest, that sometimes that's not successful. There are some parts of our experience in Adelaide that I wasn't happy that we did it as well as we could. And that was something that was pointed out to me in the report from the Royal Commission that came to study what happened in regard to that particular case. So it's a big value for me. Sometimes I have failed in that area, but I would really make it a high point to try to engage with the survivors as much as I can.
It seems from your answer that your position is similar to Archbishop Costello's, which is the vast majority of your meetings are within the formal facilitation stage of Towards Healing.
That's right. That's right.
Have you indicated broadly to those within your community of a willingness to speak to survivors who wish to speak to you outside of any redress process?
I don't think I've done that explicitly, but I've certainly given the message out in the community that I'd be willing to see people and talk to them. But I've never made a statement explicitly saying that.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
I've had a number of meetings with survivors or family members of survivors, both within Towards Healing and outside Towards Healing. So sometimes people have just asked to meet me. They don't want to go through a Towards Healing process, but they want me to hear or the church to hear, or they want to hear me say I'm sorry for what's happened. And so I've had those. On a few occasions I can think of, I've actually reached out to someone that I've thought from reading their story or hearing about them that they weren't dealt with as well as they could be, so I've actually initiated the contact or offered it. So it's happened in those different ways. Also, I've had some contact with some survivors groups too, and that's been another way I've encountered where they've come, perhaps 3 or 4 of them as a group, wanting to tell me some things. And so in those different ways, I've had conversations with survivors, heard their stories and tried as best I can to tell them how ashamed and sorry I am for what's happened.
Is it invariably the case that it is you, as representative of the Archdiocese, who meets with those survivors going through towards healing who wish to meet with the church representative?
Any ones that I hear of that want to meet me, and I'm convinced my staff know that, we make that happen. Now, it may be that sometimes it's not as quick as they might like, but as far as I know, I don't know of any case of someone who's in that situation asked my professional standards people to meet the Archbishop or been offered that and then found they couldn't because I wasn't available.
Is it the case that you meet them in circumstances where they make a specific request, otherwise your Vicar General usually meets them?
That would be right. Normally, at first instance, the Vicar General and the Director of Professional Standards would be the people they first meet. And as soon as they form a view that it would be helpful, they'll even suggest it to the survivors, so that it doesn't have to be them demanding or asking to see me. It might also be proposed to them if it was thought that that would be helpful to them. Some people like that. Other people are understandably very angry, and it's the last thing they want to do to meet me. But either way, I try and accede to any request.
Similar to the question I've asked the other two archbishops, have you made it known in your community of a willingness outside of a redress process to speak with anyone who wishes?
Probably only implicitly, in that I've talked about the different survivors who have come to talk to me and their harrowing stories and the shame I felt. So I've made it clear to my people I do meet with survivors, that I'm not behind some protective wall. But I haven't put out a 1-800 number for anyone that wants to ring me, that's true. I have made it clear to my professional standards office, and it's usually the first people they make contact with that I would be available. So in that indirect way, I suppose it's made clear. But I haven't made a public statement, call this number and the Archbishop will be available. Have
you visited with survivors outside of the church structure?
Yes, I've gone for walks in parks. I've met, sometimes they've said they don't want to go near a church building or a church office, and I've gone to them. I remember meeting one in a coffee shop, one in a cricket field, other places, yes.
What period of time are we talking about, Archbishop Fisher, with your involvement with Towards Healing?
So I have been the Archbishop now for 2 years, and for 5 years before that I was Bishop of Parramatta, so it's 7 years now that I've had some responsibility in those areas. Most of your engagements have been with survivors at Parramatta? Yes, most have been at Parramatta. Significantly less at Sydney? Significantly less in Sydney. You may know I was in hospital for most of last year, and so I've only really had about a year in office as Archbishop of Sydney. Thank you. Archbishop Hahn?
Certainly, I've always made the opportunity available for individuals who want to talk with me, whether in a formal context at the end of the process or at any other time. I realise how difficult it can be for a survivor. They might want to talk to a church person so that I can express my shame and apology. They might find it impossible to get here. Since we last spoke, I've expanded the pastoral care team in the Vicar General's office. We have a senior advisor, a religious sister with 19 years' experience in family and social welfare, and another 12 years as the superior of a religious order, who's a very welcoming, accommodating person. What typically happens is that an engagement goes with her. She then walks with them to meet with me, with whoever they may want, but also she continues the relationship if that is what people want. So we are expanding that, and we hope that that will meet the very real suffering and very terrible, terrible evil that has been perpetrated upon the survivors.
Just before I come to you, Archbishop Coleridge, can I ask the four of you first, has there been an occasion where you have met with a survivor on more than one occasion? Perhaps starting again with you, Archbishop Costello.
Yes, not many. Normally it's only one meeting, but on 2 or 3 occasions, yes, I have.
At their initiative?
Yes.
Archbishop Wilson?
Yes, I think on one occasion.
I'd say the same as Archbishop Costello on a few occasions.
Thank you. Archbishop
I
Hart?
think on one occasion, with the explanation I gave about the expansion of the pastoral care, which does go on now.
Have you met people out of the Towards Healing process or a redress process?
I follow the behavioural aspects of Towards Healing. We have the Melbourne response, of course, but outside, on occasions when people have asked, yes.
But as with your colleagues, overwhelmingly it's through a redress process that you engage with.
That would be right, yes.
Archbishop Coleridge?
The same would be true of me, that overwhelmingly my contact with survivors would have been through the Towards Healing process, which is not really a redress process. In my own view, and I think in the view of many, it's intended at least to be a pastoral process. So within that process, and at the end of it, there is a meeting which I attend whenever possible. This was not the case when I came to Brisbane, I have to say, that at times there was no official of the Archdiocese attended that meeting, or it was someone who was not, shall we say, at the top of the pecking order. But I attend those meetings wherever possible. If I can't be there, if I'm overseas or away, then it would be usually the Vicar General, or when dealing with schools, it would be the Director of Catholic Education. I have also had some, but not many, meetings outside the process of Towards Healing. I'm certainly open to it. I haven't made any public statements to that effect. And I have had a couple of occasions that come to mind where I have met more than once in a less formal setting. There was one when I was in Canberra, and there's been one in Brisbane. But that I have to say is very unusual. So I'm open to it as a pastor rather than a bureaucrat, and but overwhelmingly my contact with survivors has been within the context of the pastoral process of Towards Healing, and in that meeting, obviously, I apologise, but perhaps even more importantly, I listen, and that's been one of the truly decisive elements of the journey that I've undertaken through years on this front, to listen to the story, which is not easy, but is absolutely essential. I have also had some contact with a group like Brave Hearts in Brisbane, which is not a church group, and but which does extraordinary work in the area of child protection. And again, my contact with them has been instructive.
Given that it has to be the case that the survivor wishes to meet with, particularly somebody in your position, and that must be the way the process is initiated, is it the case that you think that any of you would benefit from engagement with survivors in such a way that you hear their voice, as has been told to the Royal Commission, outside of a process which, I understand what Archbishop Coleridge is saying, has a pastoral element but is largely considered to be a redress process? Anyone given any thought to that?
I would be very open to it if I thought it would help. So I am open to suggestions, but sometimes in dealing with abuse, you can, with the best of intention, do things which hinder rather than help. So, but if I thought for a moment that the kind of thing you're proposing, Ms. Furness, were going to help, then I would certainly consider it, and consider it very seriously.
Does anyone else wish to comment?
I would just comment. I would agree with that. My experience, and I can only go on my own experience, but my experience of the meetings with the survivor at the end of the process, in one sense they're quite structured, but in another sense they're not. And the survivor is really the person who drives the meeting, and I can understand what you're proposing. I think it's certainly worth considering. But my experience is that I believe I do hear their voice and hear it very genuinely within that context of the pastoral meeting of Towards Healing. There may well be opportunities to do that on other occasions, but I wouldn't dismiss the value of the encounter between the survivor and the church authority if it's conducted in a proper way. As long as it's not too formal, too structured, as long as it's a genuine meeting of people, I think it has a lot of value.
Or indeed too formulaic, Archbishop, if indeed that's the place where each of you most meets victims, which follows a structure and has probably a same facilitator there on each occasion, and you perhaps have the same Vicar General or similar person with you, so that it loses or may lose to some extent its impact.
That I have to say, Ms Furness, has not been my experience. I take the point about it becoming formulaic, but at times the structure can be in some ways liberating. And my experience of most of these meetings is that there's something intensely personal. It depends on individuals, obviously. But I don't think that a formal structure necessarily inhibits the intensely and deeply personal character that these meetings are intended to have. I certainly try and make it as informal and as personal as I can, but so whilst there is a risk of the formulaic approach, I don't think it necessarily needs to work that way, and in fact, as I say, the formula can at times be strangely liberating.
Archbishop Hart?
I've certainly found that the involvement of the senior advisor, who's a woman from the Vicar General's office, who's got social skills, immediately the survivor comes and they feel they've got someone who is supporting them as well as being with me, and it takes on very much, if you'll excuse the pun, a heart-to-heart talk, and good can very much result, particularly from that experience and then from how things go on in the future.
Thank you. Archbishop Fisher?
I don't know if I gave the impression that nearly all my meetings have been within Towards Healing, but
No, you didn't, Archbishop.
But I can think offhand immediately of at least half a dozen that have been quite outside any redress process, where just person concerned has expressed a desire to meet me to tell me their story. And it might be they're looking for an apology, it might be they just want me to know what happened, it might be that they're looking for some help of some kind, but it's not necessarily part of a formal Towards Healing or civil litigation or other kind of process. There have been some of those as well. I think both have proved in general to be useful. Certainly useful to me in learning more about this awful phenomenon, but I think often for the individuals that wanted to be heard, it's been helpful too.
Archbishop Wilson?
Ms Ferris, I've been bishop of 2 dioceses, and the experience of dealing with the problems associated with sexual abuse are very different in both places. I had the good fortune when I went to Wollongong and walked straight into a huge problem in this area to be able to work with Kath McCormack, who at that stage was the head of Catholic welfare in Wollongong. And she and I worked together to put things together and work out how we were going to respond and reach out to people and so on. And in that process, she organised with me a meeting that we held quietly, so that all the victims, all the people who were survivors were able to come and talk and share with me. And that happened one Saturday afternoon and lasted several hours. I was only in Wollongong a short time and was moved out there to Adelaide and walked into another experience which was very different, in that what I had to deal with there was not sexual abuse by clergy very much, but by a major case involving a bus driver in a school who supposedly, because it's very hard to calculate, but was probably in the position where he would have been able to abuse 35 children that he had contact with. And then responding to that situation again, we held another public meeting and gathered people together, and they spoke about their concerns and so on, and responded to that. But I've not had any contact with other groups who are associated with the survivors of clergy sexual abuse.
Thank you. Now, in addition to the theme of listening to the victim being a response which is desired above and beyond policies, procedures and apologies and the like, is showing leadership on an individual basis, that is an archbishop or bishop basis, to the diocese. Again, Archbishop Costello,
yes.
How have you shown leadership above and beyond the matters we've discussed?
In relationship to dealing with survivors, or in relationship to the whole issue?
In relationship to the whole issue.
Well, I've tried to do quite a number of things. I can briefly explain them if you wish. I have issued a number of pastoral letters to the people of the Catholic community. I have a belief myself that not everyone agrees with, that my first responsibility, and in a sense the only community to which I have a right to speak, is the Catholic community. I'm not the leader of anything else in Western Australia, just the Catholic Church. And so I would normally, in fact, I would say always, unless it's issuing a general media release, speak to our own people. So I have tried on a number of occasions to express the deep horror that I and I think pretty well every Catholic in my archdiocese feels about this. And I think people, they want to see the leader articulate genuinely the shame of the whole church, and I've tried to do that. I've done all sorts of things that in some sense are in and of themselves relatively small in relationship to the way the Professional Standards Office operates, the way we apply towards healing, improving, I think, if I could put it this way, the fidelity to the protocols of towards healing. I've spent a lot of time and effort trying to heighten the awareness of our priests about the seriousness of this matter. I speak to them often about this, write to them often about this. It's always a part of my addresses to clergy. I've put some very practical things into place. I think the main reform that I've instituted is the safeguarding project in the Archdiocese. I've tried to be proactive in making child welfare and child protection the fundamental concern, the fundamental issue of the Archdiocese at the moment. And I made that decision when I was appointed as Archbishop.
What challenges do you face working within the culture and structure of the Catholic Church to show the leadership you believe is necessary to those who have survived child sexual abuse and want to know that you're stopping it happening again in your diocese?
What challenges do I face?
Yes.
If I could answer in a negative way in one sense, I haven't encountered major resistance to anything that I've tried to do. So I don't face the challenge of a group of priests, for example, who are resistant to what I'm trying to do or angry about what I'm trying to do. I would say that my impression is to the contrary, that I think that people are very grateful that there are initiatives being developed, there are new things being done. And so I don't find any opposition in that sense or any challenge. I think one of the big challenges for all of us, I suspect, around the country as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, is to avoid any hint that we're now on top of this issue and we can say, OK, we tick that box and we move on. So keeping it at the forefront of people's minds, I think, is a challenge.
Archbishop,
yes.
You and the others, your colleagues, accepted from Ms Vaness that the sexual abuse of children in the church reflects a failure in leadership.
Yes.
You all accepted
Yes.
that.
Yes.
What have you done, firstly, Archbishop Costello, to review the leadership within the church or in your diocese? To be able to say to the people gathered here and listening elsewhere, I have started to, or indeed I do understand, why the leadership failed. What have you done in that space?
In terms of started to, I think one of the things that I have done, and this is in a sense an overall concept, we've just concluded a very extensive consultation process about the whole life of the Archdiocese, the needs of the Archdiocese, the future of the Archdiocese, and I won't go into all of the details, but that process of consultation led to eventually formulation of a plan for the next 5 years, which has many elements in it. I identified professional standards and dealing with the crisis of child sexual abuse as the number one priority. I've done a number of things in terms of improving, I think, the capacity of the Archdiocese to respond. So when I took over as the Archbishop, the Director of Professional Standards was only part-time, and I increased that to a full-time position, provided extra administrative support as well, and then we've had other people join that staff. These are kind of concrete steps that I've taken to...
Well, they're all steps that respond to the problem that exists. But the problem emerged, as I understand you to be agreeing, from a failure of leadership within the church.
Yes.
Now, it's one thing to deal with the illness once the symptoms have emerged, but unless you address the leadership failure and understand why it happened, you won't deal with the problem, will you?
Well, the problem will always be potentially there to arise again unless that issue is dealt with. That's certainly true.
Can I press you again? What have you done to examine the failure of leadership, if you accept is at the root of this problem?
I'm not sure if this is what you're asking me, but I would say, for example, that I have adopted a style of leadership that is, I hope, more consultative than has been the case in the past. Now, it's limited consultation, but it's a much broader consultation. So I think I could genuinely say that there would not be a significant decision that I have taken in the Archdiocese that I've taken without consultation. I think that is a response to what tended to be an issue in the past, where the bishop was perhaps regarded as almost like a little monarch in his own diocese and could make whatever decisions he wanted, irrespective of what advice he might seek or not seek. I've changed that, I think, quite deliberately and quite significantly. That touches, I think, one of the issues that has come up often in the Royal Commission under the broad heading of culture, and I've tried to change the culture so that the Archdiocese understands that there is a consultative approach to decision-making. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but that's one response.
Maybe part of the issue. Would any of the other of you archbishops like to grapple with this issue? And I rather thought, Archbishop Costello, what you might say to me is that the Bishops' Conference is working in this space. But
I'm sorry, I thought you meant just in the Archdiocese of Perth.
And generally.
Okay.
But can anyone else help me?
Your Honour, I'd like to talk about that. It seems to me that in the issues about leadership, that there's a very big responsibility on the shoulders of we who are the leaders now. In coming in and looking at what's happened in the past, it's a big responsibility for us to make sure that everything is changed and made to work properly. We have responsibility, as you say, not only in our own diocese but throughout our whole country. We have a big responsibility through the Bishops' Conference And so the formulation at the beginning of the National Committee for Professional Standards, which was a decision taken by the Bishop and religious, was meant to be, and I believe has been, a major change in the area of leadership. And that organisation has worked really hard and with great insight to change the culture and the pattern of our behaviour. So a lot of developments have occurred that way. The other point is that as we've been moving ahead through all this too, that we've established working relationships with people involved in this area in other countries and at the Holy See, trying to work out ways where we'd be able to work well in dealing with the issues that we face in this area. And when I became a bishop and was confronted by this, in my analysis, I thought that in order to show leadership, that there were 4 areas that we needed to make some change or take some new initiatives. The first is to reach out to the people who are the survivors and their families. The second was to deal effectively with the perpetrators, which involved then making sure that we fulfilled our obligations according to the law. The third was to work really hard to make sure that we did all that we could in selection and formation, that pedophiles wouldn't appear in the clergy and be able to do the terrible things that they did. And the fourth was to establish a safeguarding program for our children, so that the whole community of the Catholic Church will be really aware of all the values that need to be put into place to protect children, give them the opportunity to develop and grow in a way that they can be free and make responses to people and understand that they need to be treated with respect and kindness. So I think in terms of leadership, that we've been working, trying to put all those elements into place. And what began in 1996 through the development of the committee, the establishment towards healing and so on, has developed and grown since. It wasn't perfect then. It's not perfect now. We have new initiatives to take now that have been discussed before the Commission, and they're another step on the road of trying to change this and to establish a new pattern of leadership.
Archbishop Coleridge.
Episcopal leadership, Your Honour, is exercised really at 3 levels: local, national and international. The mix varies from bishop to bishop, but the formula is the same. And at each of those 3 levels, episcopal leadership has been changing and is going to change further. Episcopal governance is a kind of non-negotiable in the Catholic Church, but it can take so many different forms and has historically. Now, if you take the Bishops' Conference, which works nationally, it can't tell bishops what to do, though it can exercise a subtle but powerful form of social pressure or peer group pressure. And there has been from within the conference a very strong desire expressed by the bishops to move from an administrative modus operandi to a pastoral modus operandi, and that's the shift that's taking place. Now, as we become a more genuinely pastoral body, the kind of leadership of which you speak becomes more possible. Similarly, too, the relationship between, say, the Holy See and the local churches is changing, and I think Baroness Holland spoke of that this morning, so that it's at each of those 3 levels that shifts are happening. But if one word sums up the shifts happening at each of the 3 levels, I think it would have to be collaborative. That we are learning to collaborate in new ways, not only bishops collaborating with each other, but within their diocese, as Archbishop Costello has said, collaborating in all kinds of ways which in the not too distant past were unthinkable, but also working more collaboratively with the Holy See, particularly in this area of abuse. So that it seems to me that if we are genuinely going to provide leadership in this area of abuse, it goes to the heart of what it means for bishops to be leaders in the church across the board. In other words, this is not an isolated area. The kind of failures of leadership and the requirements of leadership now that have been identified go to the very heart of what the church is and does. And that's why, in many ways, this Royal Commission, I think particularly in this final hearing, has served mightily to generate what I would take to be the agenda of the plenary council of which I've spoken, where we will have to make big decisions about the future of the Catholic Church in this country, including the shape of episcopal leadership, which is very much on the table because it's been on the table so evidently here.
Are the other two of you wish to say something?
I'll go. Certainly, Your Honour, I'd echo what Archbishop Coleridge is saying. I've been a bishop nearly 20 years. What is very evident in the Bishops' Conference is the desire to look at issues with people, to look at the feelings of people, the problems of people, and how we can walk with them. It's much more collaborative. It's much more engaged with the challenges that we have in our society, and they may be moral, they may be family, they may be societal, but also to look at what we can do as a church to engage with those needs and to do so in a way which builds up and encourages people.
Archbishop Fisher.
Yes. I think there's lots of ways. I've tried to think how I can be a better leader, or those working with me as leaders can be better. What can we learn from what's gone wrong? And so I would think, like Archbishop Costello, certainly my style of leadership would be much more consultative than might have been in the old model of the monarchical bishop. I would always have a group of people working with me before I made any significant decisions. I think I involve a lot more external review. So when I first came into each of my dioceses, I had people come from outside and look at our performance in this area and how it could be improved, and look at our structures and review our cases and so on, so that I want to take into account other perspectives from people who are not part of my bureaucracy already, or not employed by me necessarily. I try also to lead by example. So if I'm saying to my priests, you all have to have education in this area, know the protocols, have training in professional standards and professional integrity, well, I have to submit to that myself. If I ask them to all have appraisals, regular appraisal of their performance as leaders, I have to submit to that myself. And so the group of Sydney bishops have just recently agreed that just as we're going to be asking our clergy to have a regular appraisal, that we'll also go through that process of external people commenting on our performance. So I think in those ways, I'm trying proactively to learn from both from what's been done well in the past, but also what's been revealed to have gone wrong, and try and be leading differently. And I ask the same of the people that lead with me.
Well, that opens up some of the issues in the territory, but I'm sure Ms Vanessa is going to pursue a number of questions with you.
Well, turning to what went wrong, from the discussion you have just had, it's clear that each of you are of the view that the leadership failed monumentally in the past, and you've spoken, each of you, as to how your leadership, you believe, differs from the leadership in the past. But perhaps, again, with you, Archbishop Costello, we can start with what was it about the leadership in the past that was a causal factor in not only the appalling abuse that occurred, but the appalling response to that abuse?
I think there are probably many ways of approaching that question. I think one of the ways I would express it would be to borrow a phrase that Archbishop Coleridge, I think, used earlier on in this commission hearing, and that is that the church, this is a cultural question, the church in a sense saw itself largely as, I think the phrase the Archbishop used was a law unto itself, that it was somehow or other so special and so unique and in a sense so important that it stood aside from the normal things that would be a part of any other body that works or exists in a society. So I think there was a profound cultural not sure what the word is, not instinct exactly, but a profound cultural presupposition perhaps about the uniqueness of the church and the specialness of the church, in a sense the untouchability of the church, that it didn't have to answer to anybody else, it only had to answer to itself. And I think if you look at that at the global level of the church, you then can take it down and say, well, that's probably going to be the way many bishops in their own diocese might also think of themselves, as a law unto themselves, as not having to be answerable to anybody, as not having to consult with anybody, but just to make decisions, in a sense, out of their own wisdom without consulting the wisdom of anybody else. And I think that can then trickle down to the priest in the parish. I would see that as one of the major causes of this inability to deal with this terrible crisis. And in that sense, I would see it as a fundamental cultural issue.
Given your explanation, it seems then that the change will only come about due to the individual characteristics of a bishop.
No, I think it's more than just the individual characteristics of a bishop. I think there was a way of understanding the church which each bishop may well have bought into, but it was permeating the whole culture of the church. So just changing the individual bishop's approach, important though that will be, needs to be informed by a reimagining of what the church is really supposed to be all about, how the church relates to the wider world in which it lives.
But the bishop could stand outside of that reimagining and say, no, I prefer the old way, and there's nothing to stop him doing that.
I'm not sure that there's nothing to stop him. I think the very experience that we're going through at the moment is a powerful impetus to the church generally, and then to individual bishops within the church, to realise that we can't continue to live with the kinds of presuppositions we had in the past. So I don't think I wouldn't agree that it's easy, let me put it that way, for a bishop to stand out of this. It's possible, yes.
Bishops in the past did stand outside that. We know that there were some bishops who operated in dioceses well.
Yes.
And we know there are some bishops who operated appallingly in dioceses and let dreadful things happen.
Yes.
And they were working within the same culture, broadly speaking.
And I'm not able to explain why some bishops, if I can put it this way, why some bishops seemed to get it and other bishops didn't seem to get it. But I think it perhaps leads to the question or the comment about the power of that cultural presupposition about the uniqueness of the church and, as I said before, the untouchability of the church. Now, not every bishop would have operated that way, not every bishop would have seen it that way, but for those who did, it had catastrophic consequences.
How do you bring with you those that did in the past, or those now that have a similar view, albeit one not expressed as loudly as they might have in the past?
Well, I think that the growing influence of the Conference of Bishops is one opportunity. I've only been a bishop for 10 years. That's a fairly long time, but in the scheme of things, perhaps not so much. My experience of the Bishops' Conference is that all of these kinds of issues are on the table, they're discussed. People speak very frankly about many of these issues. As Archbishop Coleridge said, there's nothing that I, as the Archbishop of Perth, can do to determine how the Archbishop of Brisbane operates within his own diocese. But the culture has changed, the understanding has changed. I think that the face of the church, in Australia anyway, in 2017, is vastly different to the face of the church. I'm presuming this because I wasn't there at the time, but say in the 1950s, I'm sure that the face of the church is very different now. So I think the likelihood of the contemporary church throwing up an aggressively monarchical kind of bishop, if I can use that expression, is very low. now.
Archbishop Hart, you probably are the longest standing bishop on the panel, is that right?
On this panel, yes. No, Archbishop Wilson is.
I'm sorry, Archbishop.
I'm the oldest, thank you.
Well, as the oldest Archbishop
The
Wilson,
longest.
Yeah.
you've experienced the change that Archbishop Costello has spoken of, and no doubt you knew well some of the bishops we're referring to, as did well and less well. What can you help us about there being a change and how the change has been affected?
Well, Ms Vanessa, I believe this is a multifaceted thing that needs to be considered in many different ways. One of the big challenges for us is theological, in that over the last 100 years there's been a huge shift in the way the Church thinks about itself, which was expressed very clearly in the Second Vatican Council. That then takes some time to permeate through the life of the Church. It's partially there now because in 1983 a new code of canon law was given to the Church, which guides bishops and everybody else in what they're supposed to do. And that code of canon law is shot through with the vision of the Church that comes from the Second Vatican Council. Elements like the role of lay people, the role of women and so on, all part of that change. I also think that part of the difficulty that we've had in responding to this crisis about sexual abuse was simply based on the fact that people just didn't know and understand what they were dealing with. I don't think they really understood the nature of sexual abuse of children and the effect that it had on the children.
It was a crime, Archbishop.
Yes, that's right. But, I mean, they didn't... But I'm just saying, though, on the level of... appreciating the reality of it, they didn't know that. I understand there was a crime. And then the other element, that would be that I think that we have big cultural changes around us in the society that we live in that will have already and will continue to have an effect on the way that we experience ourselves as a church. One of the big shifts has been that when you use the word church, often people would just believe they're referring to bishops and priests, whereas the word church means everybody. But
just coming back to your proposition that no one really knew what was happening and what it all meant, the Church since at least the 4th century has been regulating the conduct of priests and religious in relation to small children on the grounds that it was at the very least misconduct and at the worst the most serious crime.
That's right.
How can it be then that after centuries of that knowledge, it appears in the 60s, 70s and 80s that they didn't know what they were dealing with?
I just think that's ignorance. People lost their knowledge and were unable to reflect on the experience of the Church in regard to this matter.
Archbishop Hart?
I'd certainly say that while there were pardon me, things that happened in the 60s, 70s and 80s, it was always wrong, but the vision seemed to be in a strange way, we're different, and they just didn't drill down to the reality. There was an unreality of the way in which bishops operated, and they just sort of floated above it, and it just didn't. The awful reality of these crimes didn't make contact with them. I don't understand why, but I do know that the way we act now is very, very different. The way we consult with people in various areas and relate to the people who... Very little comes up to me that hasn't been reflected on by a group, the people in social welfare or in evangelisation or whatever. Now, that's not an excuse, but it's an explanation of how things have changed.
But if I just say to everyone in the audience, it's very important that we hear from the archbishops and that they have an opportunity to answer Ms Vanessa and the Commissioner's questions. I'd be grateful if you would keep any comments out of the hearing so that that opportunity is properly provided. Thank you.
In the case of embezzlement, Archbishop, which is a crime. In the 60s or 70s, if somebody, a priest, embezzled the diocese for a significant amount of money, now that's a crime,
That's a crime.
And the diocese, I suggest, wouldn't have any hesitation in dealing with the person who embezzled the money as though he had committed a crime.
Correct.
And leaving aside the civil authorities for the moment,
Correct.
they would deal with it professionally.
Certainly.
Why is child sexual abuse different?
I think it might have been the thing that wasn't spoken about. You know, it was so far out of their consciousness. Your Honour, I've given evidence before about people in my situation who just couldn't believe that a priest would do these terrible crimes. I'm not one of them. And I think that's that illustrates the mindset. It doesn't excuse it, but it illustrates what the mindset was, that it was just out there and it was left out there. And that's a serious failure of responsibility.
Isn't it the same with fraud? That if the priest was in the idealised state that we've spoken about and unique and perfect and above others, you couldn't believe that he'd steal money. But
well, I like your question and your analogy. I think really that sort of shows the mental divide that might have been there. I don't approve of it.
Archbishop Fisher?
I think there was, as Archbishop Wilson said, a tremendous ignorance of the prevalence in the community, in families, in the church of this terrible evil. People knew of individual cases of it. I don't think they understood its prevalence. They certainly didn't understand its the terrible damage it did, or the fact that it would seem to us now very little you can do to cure it, as it were, in a perpetrator. People thought that there were things you could do, spiritual exercises or a quick course of psychotherapy or something. So there was, I think ignorance was a factor. I think there was a lack of empathy too often, that people didn't, it's not just they didn't understand intellectually, they didn't feel the pain that was being caused and the long-term pain. And part of both of those was a self-protectiveness on the part of the institution, that you didn't want scandal, you didn't want causes for people to think less of the clergy or the bishops or religious of the institution. And so you might say things were staring us in the face, but it seemed to me people wouldn't see it because they just wanted to protect the name or the institution very often.
But Archbishop, it seems inconsistent to on the one hand say that the church and the leaders of the church were ignorant of it, ignorant of the consequences. If that's the case, why was so much effort put into covering it up and being secret about it if it was not something that was known and understood?
When I talk about the ignorance of its prevalence and its damage, I think that this was a commonplace. I think kids went and told their parents and were told to stop such talk sometimes. That they told their teachers and they were told, how dare you talk about Father that way. It wasn't just bishops behaving this way. I think probably the leadership class generally in Australia was very protective of its own, and add the clericalist culture and the self-protectiveness of the institution. It magnified this terribly. So it's not just one little bit of this puzzle. You've got to put it all together. But I think when I say there's ignorance, I don't mean that people didn't know it was evil, that it was a terrible sin and a crime. They knew that full well. And that's part of, as you say, why they covered it up when it happened. But I think they didn't appreciate the long-term damage this was doing to people, the repetitiveness of it, almost addictiveness of it in some of the perpetrators. The fact that there is no way to manage that by moving someone somewhere else, that you've actually got to completely contain them, possibly for the rest of their life. I think people didn't understand that, and maybe we still don't fully understand the phenomenon of paedophilia. Maybe future generations will look back at us in 2016 the way we look back at people in the 50s and think how primitive they were in their understandings or in their responses. But I think we certainly understand better now, and I really believe empathise better now than often seems to have happened in the past.
You'd be familiar with Dr. Marie Keenan's work.
Yes.
And she described that the offenders within the church were there and had the characteristics that were unique to the Catholic Church and the way in which the Catholic Church operated. You'll be familiar with what I'm saying. If that's the case, then what was happening in the rest of society, albeit with familial or dealing with church-related matters but outside of the structure of the church, seems to have less effect?
Well, I think if we want to understand the problem, we have to understand the whole context and understand, for instance, how prevalent this was in the whole community and in other institutions. And we've got some insight into that through this Royal Commission and through other people's studies, such as Dr. Keenan's. But there's no doubt you have both a perennial problem in communities that perhaps was better or worse at particular times in Australia, and those factors specific to particular institutions, and we're focusing here on the Catholic Church. And there were some real ones. I think you have the intersection of these three powerful things of sex and power and religion here that coincided in a very destructive direction, particularly in the 50s, 60s and 70s that we've seen such a terrible tsunami as you described it earlier. I think there's a broader social context, there's a longer history of, you've taken us back to the 3rd or 4th century, but there's also something that was particularly awful at a particular time that's led to the demand for a thorough investigation.
Bishop, it may be, you speak of the 50s, 60s and 70s. Given that we know it's been happening for centuries, many of those who might have been abused in the 30s, 20s, 30s and 40s will have, of course, passed on long before the issue rose to the public domain, which, of course, it ultimately did. And as you know, once out in the public domain, many more people have come forward. I mean, thousands have come to this commission, many of whom have never been to anyone else before. So that I'm not sure, but that it's appropriate to see it just as a phenomenon that was happening in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And if you look at it in that way, you may be missing the real issues that lie behind this.
Yes. Thank you, Your Honour. Look, I'm not wanting to say for a moment it had never happened before and hasn't happened since. There's some reason to think that there was a spike in this period. Some reason to think. But as you say, people weren't as free to speak of it in the past, and since then it may be some people are still not ready to speak of it, but may in the future. So we may discover there's more in the 80s and 90s than we realise.
Well, we know that it takes men maybe 30 years.
Yes, well, so we'd expect if the rates were similar that at least the 80s would be showing by now, because they're 30 years on from there, and they're not. So it does seem there was a spike, but it's not to diminish. I mean, one act of this is infinitely too many at any time in history, today or any time. But if we're trying to get to, well, what were the factors that led to a particular problem in a particular institution, then we're looking for what was happening then and there. And I think there were some very particular things happening then and there. It was a time in history when the Catholic Church was doing a lot of the heavy lifting with children of orphanages, schools for poor kids, boys groups, whatever, and some of that I think was actually very good work. It was a very important contribution to this nation, but it also created opportunities for some terrible predatory behaviour. It was a period of a huge rise of vocations, huge numbers coming in to the priesthood and religious life, and it would seem very little serious selection going on. It was like all comers. It was a period of big change happening in the church and in the broader culture, and some disorientation. So I think you have a number of things happening in this period that might explain the spike, if there is a spike. But I take your point, we don't fully know that because we don't have all the data of history
We'll never know.
and may never know.
You referred to the intersection of sex, power and I think it was theology. What was your third?
Sex, power and religion, the sort of three topics you don't discuss at the dinner table.
It depends on your dinner table, I suspect, Archbishop. Those three matters are not dissimilar from Dr. Ransom's theory. Certainly he used slightly different language, but that was the effect of it. Is it the case that your reference to power is effectively a reference to clericalism?
Well, that's part of it. I think that part of it's about violence. I think we've come to understand this is not, it's too simple to call this just sex. It's often about violence, about the abuse of power and authority. So there were other things going on in these crimes, and there are other things going on in why this was facilitated, permitted, overlooked, covered up and so on, to do with power.
So what has changed in relation to your trilogy of sex, power and theology from then to now in the church?
I think our understandings of all three have changed quite dramatically. I think lots of people would say they still need more change, or that we've hardly begun to digest some of, say, what the Vatican Council said to us about authority as service, leadership as service, not as an elitist class who are above accountability, transparency. But some of that certainly has changed in my lifetime, in my experience. Attitudes to sex, I think you've heard from some previous witnesses, there was a time when it was unspeakable or was just seen as sort of shameful. I think it's much more out in the open. People talk about it more. They talk about its abuses as well as its proper place in intimate relationships. And also with respect to religion, I think people now will be much more ready to critique, to not see it as a taboo area where I mustn't have anything to say. In terms of your earlier questions of it, how am I convinced I can't be an absolute monarch the way some others might have been? Well, for one thing, people won't let me. People just won't have it. They might have once. Today, my priests and my people, if I start behaving tyrannically, one way or another, they'll vote with their feet, they'll vote with their voices, they'll go to the media, they'll be sending me petitions. I will know that they're dissatisfied. And that mightn't have happened at some times in the past where people had an idealised view of bishops or people in authority and they didn't complain. But today, we're under much more scrutiny from the general public. Our own people are much more likely to say their say, and I do believe in general we're wanting to hear them. It's painful sometimes to hear it, but I think most of us want to hear it now.
Archbishop Costello, as you would be aware, there's been much discussion of governance,
yes,
and the way in which governance may have contributed to not only the fact of abuse but the response to abuse. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that you want to share with us?
I would suggest that the kinds of things that we've just been talking about in relationship to the ways in which bishops now hopefully are exercising the rightful authority that they have is very different to in the past. So, along with Archbishop Fisher, I would say that it's not my style anyway, but if I were to try and be very autocratic and just make demands and not give any explanations or not try and bring people with me to consider my points of view or my suggestions, I would just lose cooperation and I wouldn't be able to function. So I think there is a very different way of being a bishop now. In terms of governance, I think Archbishop Coleridge has mentioned that the way our church is structured, there are certain things that are, if you like, fixed in stone that we, certainly the Australian bishops, are not able to change structurally from that point of view. So the structures of governance, the ways of working within those structures, I think, has changed dramatically and can continue to change. One of the problems in the past, and I go back really to what I was saying before, is that there was this very deeply developed concept that we are immune from criticism. We shouldn't be scrutinised. We are a law unto ourselves, and as I said before, if that's a general feeling in the air of the church, it will express itself possibly in the way bishops, some operate, then in the way priests operate in their parishes or religious operate in their institutions. So I think it's a question of the way in which the structures of governance are exercised, if I can put it that way.
Well, you'd accept that at least one of the principles of good governance is transparency.
Yes.
And one of the issues in the past was a significant degree of secrecy.
Yes.
How is the church now, through the area you work in as Archbishop of Perth, more transparent?
Well, I'm not sure that we're hiding anything, so I'm...
How do we know you're not hiding?
Well, you're welcome to come and investigate.
Well, not an uncommon way of being transparent is producing documents that tell parishioners and the public generally what you were doing.
Yes.
Now, I don't know that the Archdiocese has an annual report, does it?
No, we don't.
That might be one way of being more transparent.
Yes, certainly. Yes.
Another might be publishing statistics in relation to professional standards, so the public know what the numbers are, what you're doing with these people, what the outcomes are.
Yes, yes. And we haven't published those statistics so far.
Another aspect of good governance that's generally considered is having a diverse mix of skills and experience on boards and other committees that assist in governance.
Yes.
The church is not quite there yet, is it?
No, it probably has a fair way to go, but I think it's made a good start. I would say that in my archdiocese, but I think probably in most jurisdictions of the church, we have boards, and we have boards of management, boards of governance, nearly always comprising lay people, lay women and lay men. So I think one of the things that's important for me anyway is to say that the church that I experience now is different from the church that I experienced when I was a boy growing up. So, and that was in the 60s and 70s. So I find I struggle a little bit because I don't recognise in the church of today some of the elements which are being identified as major contributors to this. Some I do, but not all of them. And this is one of them.
Thank you. Archbishop Wilson, you may have heard that your archdiocese received some praise from Professor Ormerod a week or so ago.
I have heard that.
And that was partly in the context of the data that was released, which indicated that your archdiocese had a rate or proportion that was significantly below the average. You're aware of that?
I am aware of that.
And Professor Ormerod gave a reason being that you and your predecessor had put in place structures where there were groups of lay people who were your advisors, and to some extent you had engaged with them in the governance of the Archdiocese.
That's right. In the history of the Archdiocese of Adelaide, there's been a long period of involvement of lay people in the life of the Church. After the Second World War, our diocese was very heavily influenced by what was called the Cardine method of youth and looking after students. So a large number of our people who then were young adults and teenagers were involved in the life of the Church through the YCW movement, the YCS movement. And those people then went on to take up leadership positions in their parishes and so on. At the same time, Archbishop Bijević, who was the Archbishop from 1939, came home from the Second Vatican Council in 1965 and immediately began to create these new bodies that allowed people to participate in governance. So the Diocesan Pastoral Council began then and has continued on, albeit with a few changes. And then Archbishop Faulkner developed a leadership team at the top of the Archdiocese that involved women working alongside him. When I became the Archbishop, I then transformed that a little so that it would become canonical and operate within the system of canon law. So around the table, the leadership of a diocese, there are women who have heavy responsibilities and lots of delegated authority from me to do the work of the Church.
Were there any rumblings from parish priests and the like seeing women in positions of power that perhaps were refused them?
Not in my time. There could very well have been before I arrived, but no, not in my time. I think that, as I said, our diocese was very heavily influenced by the fact that so many people were involved in this YCW movement that led people to see that as a result of their baptism, they had a role to play in the life of the Church. And so it was regarded as natural that they would take up that kind of work in leadership.
When you referred to changing it to make it canonical, what do you mean?
Well, the arrangements before I went there were a sort of private arrangement made by Archbishop Faulkner, and it operated that way. I wanted to make it so there was an expression of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, and therefore an expression of the organic growth that's gone in the life of the Church since the Second Vatican Council.
What did you do that changed it?
What I did was that I appointed all of the women and some men to the position of Chancellor. Within the canonical system, there's a role of Chancellor in a diocese, and you can have a number of them. And it's possible then to create the role that they have to play by giving them a job description. And that's what we did.
And clearly, Chancellors aren't gender specific.
No, they're not.
Thank you. Now, we've left you behind, Archbishop Coleridge. However, you've given some evidence on this before. What is it that you'd like to say about governance in particular?
I do agree with Archbishop Fisher when he says that even if you wanted to, you couldn't govern in the good old monarchical way of other times. Not long ago, I finished a very fine biography of Archbishop Mannix, and I thought to myself, how extraordinary. This man died at a vast age, but in my lifetime, and yet it's as if he's a creature from some other planet. And what you see embodied in a man like Mannix, and he would have been typical of others, is a kind of monarchical understanding of episcopal governance. And this has got deep historic roots, but it's got deep theological roots too, because if you imagine God as a monarch and then Jesus as a monarch, and the apostles are sent out by Jesus, and the Pope and the bishops are the successors of the apostles, the whole structure and the model become monarchical. And it had its power and its creativity at a certain historical moment. But now it's like something from another planet, so that...
but the structure hasn't changed.
The structure is changing, but albeit slowly, but is changing. Because, for instance, if you take Pope Francis, one of the things that he is dismantling, I think, is the papal court and the monarchical model of the papal ministry. So I think this was a hugely powerful thing in the past. And it did confer upon the bishops, even in this country, certainly in Europe, a rather princely style, which could become autocratic. Power in itself it can be creative, it can be destructive. The call to serve is the call to use power creatively. Clericalism isn't just power, it's power used destructively. The other thing that strikes me is that there weren't in the past, as you seem to imply, Ms Furness, that some bishops who were, as it were, good and others who were bad. The thing that has struck me and perplexed me is that it seems to me that all bishops made the same kinds of mistakes in another time, in this country and elsewhere. And the question of why has exercised my mind mightily in recent decades. See, that they were all, if I could put it in these terms, they were invariably company men, and that had both good and bad aspects about it, I suspect. But they were more interested in the institution than in the individual. And the sense of individuality generally, certainly in the culture of the church, but more broadly in the culture, and still very strikingly in other cultures around the world, the sense of the individual is very subdued. It's the body corporate that really prevails, and I think that was the sense. So they had this passionate, lifelong commitment to the defence and promotion of the institution, and it made them blind to individuals. The other thing that happened, it seems to me, is that things like abuse were spiritualised, so that our strength became our weakness. And I could talk at length about that, and I may refer to it again later in this particular panel session, I'm not sure. But a spiritualisation of what was going on, which amounted to a complete blindness to the reality. And this became all the more striking in a post-Freudian world where we became aware, the whole society, but certainly the church became aware of what we would now call pathologies, and therefore various compulsions and addictions, which were unknown in a pre-Freudian world. So all of that erupted at the same time. How to understand the abuse of the young in a post-Freudian world as we come to grips with the nature of the pathologies to which the human being is liable.
Thank you, Archbishop. Archbishop, just 1 minute, Archbishop Wilson. Archbishop Fisher, you spoke before of there being more empathy now, and in your statement you refer many times to compassion. How do you engender empathy and compassion in a person?
Okay. One factor in this area we've talked about today, you've already identified, and that is just hearing from people who've suffered. That if you've never heard them or met them, you might have some notion about what's awry, what's wrong. But it's only when you hear people speak of just how it's damaged them and how long-lasting that's been, how it's played out in many aspects of their life, and then how it's affected those around them too, such as their family members. So I think hearing from people who've suffered is one thing that most hearts, that it'll bring some echo in that heart. Now, I think there are other things you have to do to work on building a culture of compassion, encouraging compassion in the young, in people as they're maturing, as people in formation. And one thing you do is put them in lots of different situations where people have various kinds of suffering or challenges, not just one, but we take, for instance, our young men in the seminary, and we put them in lots of different situations, like it could be in dealing with unemployed people or prisoners or sick people in hospital or disabled people. We have a deaf ministry in this diocese. There are many different kinds of suffering, and you put them with those people, and you ask such people to help mentor them, help them understand what their challenges are, what pains they have suffered.
Wasn't that part of the ministry in the past, that pastors would deal with and treat the sick and speak to those in need?
I don't think, for instance, a seminarian right back then would have had any of those pastoral experiences. So it was only once he was ordained that he was thrown into works like that, and possibly not had any mentoring either. He was just given the collar and the status and expected to know what to do. I think
cane if he was a Christian brother.
Strap.
Possibly, yes, and some kind of punishment. Now I think there's much more a sense this has to be cultivated in people. It has to be monitored that it's actually demonstrating itself too. So some people who don't demonstrate any ability to feel compassion, that's a sign, a warning sign that if it can't be cultivated in them, they're not an appropriate person for ministry going forward.
Archbishop Wilson?
Ms Vanessa, I just wanted to say that there are some changes that are already levelled at bishops in the way that they run their diocese, in that there are many different decisions a bishop makes whether he has to consult people, and the consultation is meant to be that he really listens to what they say. But there are some decisions where it comes to the point where the people who sit around the table control the decision that he makes. Every diocese has to have a finance council. Within certain parameters, the bishop cannot make a decision without the permission of those people who are around that table.
And that's in relation to money?
In relation to money, that's right. So there are ways in which the Church is gradually moving towards new ways of doing things.
Sorry, can I just ask one question, but related to that? Can I just put a proposition to you, and it's directly related to this and the new model of governance that you've talked about in your own archdiocese. Had the bishops in Australia adopted the opportunities and the possibilities presented by the Second Vatican Council in terms of pastoral councils and parish councils with true and genuine gusto, would not some of the problems that occurred in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and certainly the responses, have been quite different? Isn't it the truth that, in fact, for more than 40 years, many of the things that are necessary to abate both risk and then to respond to risk appropriately were available to each and every bishop in Australia? Some did it, most didn't. And over that time, it's waxed and waned. And so the question is, why is it that a church that was presented with such possibility, such collective wisdom and opportunities, simply failed to do that? And now we talk about them as something new, something rediscovered. But they were always available. And I think most people in looking at this issue struggle to understand that. So appreciating that it is changing, and each of you have indicated that, the lost opportunity seems extraordinary with devastating consequences. So I just wanted to ask Bishop Wilson, given that your diocese actually did follow through on that, do you have any insights as to why the Australian Church, by and large, did not embrace those practices in a consistent way over the last 40 years?
I think that there were many different reasons why they didn't do it. I think in some places they made an attempt at it and it failed. It didn't work, so they just let it go. But I don't have any answer for why people haven't taken up what's contained in the 1983 Code.
If I might, Commissioner, structures were set up. Many parishes set up pastoral councils and still have them. But structures are only as good as the people you put in them. And I'm afraid many of the structures did struggle and even fail because the people who were in those structures seemed unable to do what the structure itself required. And if one of the things that anything's emerged clearly, I suppose, in these years since the Second Vatican Council, it would be that we're never going to be saved by a structure. They do matter, but a structure is, as I say, as good as the people you put in them. The other thing is the dioceses of this country and the parishes, therefore, vary enormously. that whereas the Archdiocese of Brisbane can have councils and all these wonderful structures that were authorised by the Second Vatican Council, it's a bit harder for Wilcannia Forbes for quite obvious reasons. So that has to be taken into account. I do agree with your general claim that there has been a missed opportunity. I'm not sure it's been quite as dramatically missed as your question suggests, Commissioner, but there are many reasons why the opportunity was missed, and some of them at least I think come back to individuals, by which I mean bishops, priests and others who populated these structures, but in a way that was ineffectual.
And without labouring the point, doesn't that go to the fact that associated with the establishment of those structures, both parish councils and pastoral councils, would have needed to be a very significant commitment to training and formation? And whilst I absolutely agree that the personalities and the individuals matter, one of the absences, and it's a question, Archbishop, was that when they were established, was there a genuine commitment to the formation, training and skills development of the people that populated the structures? Because you're absolutely right, structures won't get you anywhere unless the people in it have those capacities.
I think, again, the experience was sporadic. I think in some parts, again, Archbishop Wilson has referred to the whole Cardine tradition that had taken root in the Archdiocese of Adelaide, which was precisely a formation of the kind of which you speak. And I think in other parts of Australia too, there were genuine attempts to induct people really into the vision of the Second Vatican Council. But it wasn't easy, in part because the vision itself was so dramatically different from what we had known. So yes, there were failures at adult education and deeper formation, but it wasn't as if attempts weren't made. It's at some point we seemed to run out of steam on that front of adult formation or adult education, and people just weren't prepared to turn up. So that was another problem, a loss of momentum or a loss of energy on that front, which is vital, as you say.
Archbishop Coleridge, you spoke about Wilcannia Forbes having difficulties, and any regional, presumably, or remote parish would. Isn't it the responsibility to some extent of the Archdiocese to assist those sort of parishes?
Well, some of that does go on. The Archdiocese of Brisbane, I know, resources very heavily in all kinds of ways the very large and in some ways remote diocese to our north. I know it happens in New South Wales with regard to the understanding between Sydney with all its resources and Wilcannia Forbes. So a lot of this goes on, and the Australian Bishops' Conference offers all kinds of assistance to the very remote diocese of Broome. So there is quite a bit of that collaboration that goes on. There could be more, but I think there is already quite a bit that goes on.
So if indeed a small parish was struggling, one could look to the Archdiocese to say, well, it's your turn to help this parish.
That also goes on. Again, I can speak only of the Archdiocese of Brisbane, really, and that is that we have centralised resources which are constantly offered to communities that lack them. Sometimes there's enthusiastic take-up, other times they look the other way, and you can't really force the issue. Well, I can try. I can urge, cajole, encourage and all of that, but I can't rule by fiat.
The Archbishop Hart, there's been some evidence, particularly from the Catholics for Renewal, about the need for and the lack of synods, plenaries, pastoral councils and those sort of structures to enable the Church, the leadership of the Church, to hear from the laity and speak with the laity about issues affecting the Church.
I think, pardon me, I think that was the major idea in this context as to why the 2020 plenary council was put forward. May I just digress for a minute?
So,
in a parish, I always saw myself as a talent scout. And your parish really is only as good as the people you've got and who you can draw into things. And one of the challenges that we sometimes face at parish level, some parishes do very well because they've got a whole lot of gifted people. Some parishes are lacking in that regard. Now, if we then apply that to dioceses, there are big dioceses with a lot of resources, and the challenge is how to involve the people in a whole lot of areas. It may be in areas through the, pardon me, through the relative offices for evangelisation, for education and so on, and to draw people in. I know we did have a Catholic Education Commission in Victoria, and perhaps in the context that Archbishop Coleridge mentioned, it ran out of a bit of steam. And while the commission is there, the big Catholic Education Board doesn't go ahead quite so much. So it's a bit of a, it depends where you are. They're good things, it depends on the impetus, and it depends on the ability to address and discuss the needs and topics.
There was a witness who gave evidence recently, and she said that in her experience, parish councils and parishes generally tend to grow in participation the more the parish priest allows there to be others, particularly lay people, who participate in decision making. And then when that parish priest moves on and you have one who is more autocratic, participation drops.
That's my point about being the talent scout. If you can identify people and give them their ability to serve, to use their gifts, that parish will flourish.
Thank you. Just coming back to my question about the synod, you refer to a plenary council?
There is projected a plenary council for Australia in 2020, and that's Archbishop Coleridge is leading the committee with, I think, Archbishop Wilson. You're on that, aren't you?
I am.
That's right. And the idea is to make it not just a meeting of the bishops in another guise, but to be preceded by a broad-based consultation and to be really participatory, so that we will not merely learn the lesson, the important lessons that the Commission has to give us, but so that we will grow as a church, as the people of God, with all of the gifts and talents we have.
So, Archbishop Wilson, is it prepared that there will be organised and structured and formal consultation with lay people, among others, leading up to the plenary council?
Well, Archbishop Coleridge is in charge of this process at the moment, but yes, I can say that the idea about doing this actually comes from an initiative of Pope John Paul II, who at the beginning of the new millennium said that he thought that every local church, say in Australia, needed to have a plenary council or gathering like that that would involve all the people, consultation with lay people, religious and clergy and so on, and determining what it is that we want to characterise the way that we move into this new century. So in explaining it, I've been saying that I think that what we need to do is to formulate a national pastoral plan that covers all the works we want to do.
Archbishop Coleridge, is it expected that there be consultation with advocacy groups and survivors of child sexual abuse in that consultation process?
As far as I'm concerned, there will be consultation with as many people as we can possibly consult. And unless it is that kind of consultation, it's hardly worth going to the trouble of having a thing as complex as a plenary council. So, yes. Thank you.
Your Honour, I notice the time.
Yes, very well. We'll adjourn now until 10.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes, we'll adjourn until 10 in the morning.
All stand.